I would be remiss if I didn't give a huge shout out to the students in the room. There are 2 tables full of students, and then there are other students amongst us all, right? So if you all would like to stand up, I don't want to put you on blast, but then I do. If you would stand up and just be recognized for being students at Lorain County Community College, my role is to tell you the reason for this, right? The reason for this particular section. And that is a little bit of history. We are celebrating the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And likewise, we are recognizing National Day of Racial Healing. By a show of hands, has anyone heard of the National Day of Racial Healing? That's why we're here, right? Okay, so Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I'm sure you've heard of him. He was a social activist and a Baptist minister who played a key role in the American Civil Rights Movement from the mid-1950s until his unfortunate assassination in 1968. King's birthday was finally approved as a federal holiday in 1983. A long time in between. But it proves that if you continue to push forward, good things will happen, right? And so, in all of the 50 states, made it a state government holiday by 2000. Again, a long time coming, but it came, right? So never give up. National Day of Racial Healing. It was launched in 2017. That's why some of you were not able to raise your hands, because it's relatively new, right? The National Day of Racial Healing is a call to action for racial healing for all people. So for any of you who know about LCCC and its vision, mission, and values, then you know that this goes alongside our foundational values, okay? That it originated as a part of the WK Kellogg Foundation's National Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation effort. Racism affects all of us, regardless of our background or circumstances. So that is why you all hopefully have chosen to be here today. And we are so grateful. Now, I'm going to call up my lovely co-chair, Dr. Denise Douglas.
Good morning. My name is Denise Douglas, and I serve as Dean of Social Sciences and Human Services, as well as co-chair of the Equity by Design team, along with the fabulous Kionna McIntosh-Pharms. Thank you for being here today. The time you're taking to honor the life and legacy of Dr. King, and the time that you'll take out of the week to civically engage in volunteer opportunities helps to develop LCCC's culture of care and what Dr. King often referred to as the beloved community. The King Center describes the beloved community as follows. Dr. King's beloved community is a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency not allow it. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. In the beloved community, international disputes will be resolved by peaceful conflict resolution and reconciliation of adversaries instead of military power. Love and trust will triumph over fear and hatred. Peace and justice will prevail over war and military conflict. King often said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. As Kionna mentioned today, is also the National Day of Racial Healing. Let's take a quick look at the video to highlight the importance of the National Day of Racial Healing.
Together, we have built authentic relationships and inspired collective action on how we heal from the effects of systemic racism. When we create safe spaces where truth-telling and uncomfortable conversations can happen, we have hope that healing can happen.
It is essential that we ground ourselves in a foundation of truth-telling.
There is still so much internalized racism and colorism that we need to unlearn.
The sad reality is we're living through a moment in which many people refuse to hear the truth, but that doesn't mean we should stop pushing to make them. We have to stop teaching the American myth and teach the American truth.
The underpinnings of truth, racial healing, and transformation teach us that we place the hierarchy on the value of human life and how that shows up in our society as people have differential access to health care or goods or services or quality housing.
We're taught individualism in America. Every man and woman and person for themselves. There's a lot of ways for us to show up for one another, and I think that that's the essence that we've been missing right now.
All of these issues really can be resolved if we come together and use the power of our collective action. Well, we simply can't solve on our own.
Those who are white can be part of a multiracial coalition together.
How can we get perspectives from different backgrounds, not just from the youth, but like valuing the words, the wisdom, the knowledge of our elderly people?
When we talk about racial healing, it is a collective action. It is an action that binds us together and grows a future where we can envision the beloved community that we all seek.
Our communities would not have been here had American allies not have stood up and protected our rights. This is a history that would not have been made possible without the solidarity of Black Americans who stood up for the resettlement of refugees.
You can't wait for others to do it. We need to do our part, and others will follow us, and each one of us can be a ripple effect.
We all share the air that we breathe, the oxygen that we need to live. And I think from that space, if we could all tap into that truth of our humanity, that we belong to each other, that we're responsible for each other, that as human beings we cannot survive without each other.
I believe that unity is not uniformity, that we can organize in a space where basic principles are what we adhere to. Dignity for all people, that everybody deserves to live in this world safely and free from targeting, that we all don't just survive, that we thrive.
When you look out at your community and humanity is front and center, and the contributions that community get to bring to bear, you say, man, what a beautiful world.
The path ahead, long and winding as it may be, leads in only one direction, forward. I challenge you to think boldly. Consider the power of the possible and work in solidarity. This is how we bridge the divides to transform communities for our children and future generations. This is how we heal.
Wonderful. I love that quote that we all share the air that we breathe. So today is our opportunity to really think about how we do that together. You're going to be blessed by having a conversation that you're going to listen to. Today is an opportunity for you to listen, to engage in dialogue that has the power to shape our beloved community. Kionna will introduce our special guest today in just a few moments, but before she does, you have an assignment. I know this is the only first day of class, so don't get too excited about it, but you do have an assignment. So listen, your assignment is to listen carefully to the conversation between Mayor Whitfield and Rabbi Werber. Write down some thoughts that stand out to you. So you can do that as you listen to the conversation. Maybe it's a thought that you have not considered, maybe it's a question, or something that you want to explore further. After lunch, we'll have time to go deeper into these conversations at your table. Now I'll pass it back to Kionna to introduce our special guest. Thank you.
Together.
So yes, I have the pleasure of introducing some individuals whom I think are just absolutely phenomenal. And I'm going to share the information that they have here in their bios. Frank E. Whitfield passionately pledged to transform Elyria's economy, community, and culture through meaningful collaboration. Before running for office, Mayor Whitfield served as the youngest president and CEO in the history of Lorain County Urban League from 2014 to 2019. During this time, Whitfield also served as president of the Elyria Sunrise Rotary Club, chair of the Lorain County Children's Services Board, and chair of Mobility and Opportunity for a Vibrant Community Movement in Lorain County. Mayor Whitfield's commitment to economy, entrepreneurship, and business is long-standing, and prior to his role with LCCC, he worked as the Foundation Fellow at the Nord Family Foundation, where he established a leadership program for nonprofit leaders to increase business acumen, program development, and capacity building. He also supported grant-making efforts throughout the county. Mayor Whitfield graduated from Case Western Reserve University's Weatherhead School of Management with his Master's of Business Administration in 2019, after completing the Weatherhead Executive Coaching Certificate Program in 2015. Prior to that, he earned his BA in Nonprofit Administration and Urban Studies in 2012 from Cleveland State University. But guess what, y'all? His AA in Nonprofit Administration, he earned right here at Lorain County Community College. Yes, he's a proud man of God, dearly loves his beautiful wife, Kalina, and their 4 daughters, Octavia, Sophia, Eliza, and Delilah. Have to make sure I pronounce these things accurately. He enjoys poetry, music, sports, and learning. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Mr. Frank Whitfield, who is Elyria's mayor. And then we also have another phenomenal being, Rabbi Lorain Werber. She earned her BA in Sociology and Anthropology from St. Mary's College of Maryland. We're from Washington, D.C., so that means a whole lot to me. She earned her Master's in Hebrew Arts and Letters and ordination from Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, studying in Jerusalem and Cincinnati. Her rabbinical thesis, did I say that right? Rabbinical thesis, Southern Rabbis Preaching on Civil Rights. From 1954 to 1970, explored the climate in the South and the sermons of rabbis who spoke on civil rights during that era. Rabbi Werber currently serves as the rabbi and educational director at Temple B'nai Abraham in Elyria. Doing okay, right? Okay. With an interest in interfaith work and social justice, she completed the Glass Fellowship through the APL and more recently, the Rekindle Fellowship, which brings together African Americans in Youth for Dialogue, learning in action. And I want to put emphasis on that term, and action, right? I think it's important that individuals recognize that yes, you can learn a whole lot, but unless you put it into action, it really doesn't mean a whole lot, okay? Especially okay, action is the key. If she's not working on meeting new people, you are likely to find her cycling, boxing, doodling, and crafting, or spending time with her family. And I have to give a shout out to the individuals over here because they are here representing her today. So without further ado, Rabbi Lorain Werber. That I learned that was really, really cool for me is that these two lovely beings, I'm a firm believer in the fact that all things happen for a reason, right? And these two lovely beings came together. Maybe they knew each other a little bit, maybe they didn't. But when I was reading their bios, there was something that was very, very similar to both of them. And that is, both of them share in something called first. First, Mayor Whitfield was the first African-American mayor in Lorain County, right? He deserves an applause for that. Likewise, Rabbi Werber was the first female to have that position at her school. Same for the county. Imagine that being the first of anything is not an easy task. And so for them to be the first that are also coming to Lorain County Community College to have a conversation about African Americans and Jewish communities, I think that is absolutely phenomenal. So I'm going to hush my mouth so y'all can hear from them because this conversation is going to be wonderful.
Thank you, Kionna. And good morning, LCCC. How y'all doing, Commodores? Good morning. I'm excited to be here and have this discussion with you all today. It's interesting that when I thought about it, it's so good to be home, it's quoting one of the controversial figures that we're going to actually be talking about today. Do y'all know who that is who said, "It feels so good to be home"? Where are my young people at? Who said that? Jesus, shine. It's the 50th anniversary of hip hop. Y'all don't know who that? That's Kanye West's lyric was, "It feels so good to be home," when he said it in the college jump. And that is part of what the spark of this conversation has been, this whole idea around camaraderie versus controversy. And we've seen how Kanye's comments have led to a whole host of controversy and around the Black and Jewish community. And we thought it was important to have a conversation that was a lot more healthier around this topic to really show the opportunity and also the history. So Rabbi Lorain and I are both graduates of the organization Rekindle. And Rekindle was founded, I'm gonna give you a little bit of background on it, by someone we both respect, Matt Fieldman. And I'm gonna read the mission statement real quick on Rekindle. So Rekindle's mission is to create meaningful social change by bringing emerging leaders from the Black and Jewish communities together for thoughtful and challenging dialogue, face-to-face interactions, breaking down barriers, building new relationships, and collective action. By rekindling the strong relationships and collaborative action between the Black and Jewish communities that were built during the Civil Rights Movement, we can accelerate our collective impact and increase equity. So both of us went through this amazing experience of being, in these meetings at Edwin's Restaurant in Cleveland, discussing some very hard topics, but also finding ways to build bridges. And when Kionna reached out to me about MLK Day, I knew we could not miss the opportunity to tie in our conversation because we know even during the Civil Rights Movement, we had our Jewish brothers and sisters locking arms with us to help progress this city, this country. And we thought it would be important to kind of have a dialogue about that. Then we're going to open the floor up to talk with you all about some of the questions you have. But before we jump into that, Rabbi, why don't you give us a little bit about your background, as well as talk a little bit about the history of the relationship with between African Americans and the Jewish community.
Sure, let's see, is this one working now? Good? Yeah? Okay. A couple things, breaking the rules and not answering your questions, but I will. A couple of things first. If you're standing in the back and you want to take the example of our social justice leaders and be brave enough, there's seats up here, and I think probably even a couple seats here, so you're welcome to come forward if you want and join us a little more intimately. And second, just to thank you for having me here. When we first spoke about this, I was a little leery of it, saying we really wanted to showcase the African American community and their struggles on this day. And LCCC and Mayor Whitfield were both very gracious in insisting that part of that message is that we come together and learn about one another, so I'm glad to be part of that. My background in 30 seconds or less is that I grew up in the eastern suburbs of Cleveland, and then went to school in southern Maryland, and then Jerusalem and Cincinnati, came back home to be near family, and this is my second pulpit, but I've been here over 15 years in Elyria, and accidentally fell in love with this area. So here I am. I joke that it's the longest one-year gig of anyone's lifetime, and here we are. And now, since we did that in 30 seconds, you asked about kind of the history of the Black and Jewish relationship, and we're going to do, 10,000 years in 3 minutes, if we can. So we're going to jump, but we'll start with the biblical narrative, because that's really where the Jewish understanding of our own identity and our relationship to the Black community begins. And that's because at the very center of our story, of what makes us who we are, is the idea that we were enslaved and then we became free. That's the whole Exodus narrative, and it creates, depending on what type of religious person you are, what we call the formative myth, the story of who we are, or the literal history of who we are, depending on what you believe. Either way, it's the central story of what made Jews. And what happens, if you think about it, is we go from enslavement to freedom, and the remainder of Bible and commentary is how do we now build a just and free society. So we have both a history that binds us to Black slavery, especially around Passover. You'll hear a lot of comparison and difference, kind of comparing and contrasting of these two stories. And sort of an emotional connection to the Black community, but also to the social justice work that'll bring us together. And now we're going to jump thousands and thousands. We could throw other stuff in there, but I want to address for a couple moments sort of the Civil War era, because there's a lot of misinformation about that era, and I'm going to keep that one brief. Jews at the time, and some would say today, but Jews at the time were not considered white yet. We occupied this in-between realm where we were somewhat vulnerable, and lived both in the North and the South. And the Jewish community during that era looked a lot like other communities. We didn't own more slaves. It looks like probably percentages of owners may have been similar, but actually numbers of slaves were fewer. And we had abolitionists working both in New York and the South against slavery. So we didn't stand out as the heroes of that era, but we also weren't the villains of that era. We were Americans with different opinions like others. By the time we hit, told you we're going fast through history, we're going to jump all the way to civil rights era now. Really beginning, I would say a little before, but it's the civil rights era. At that point, Jews are very disproportionately supportive of rights for African Americans. So it looks different than it looked hundreds of years before. And so we hit the civil rights era, where we have Jewish community leaders, rabbis speaking up, marching with Dr. King, the most famous being Rabbi Heschel. There may or may not, I think there is a picture up of him. We have Rabbi Joachim Prinz, who actually escaped Nazi Germany just before the Holocaust and lost family, who spoke right before King spoke at the March on Washington. And he's the one who really he's the one who stated that the most, I may have the order a little wrong, but the most tragic and the most urgent and the most shameful problem is silence. And that we can't be onlookers and need to stand up and work together. We have rabbis in the South speaking up, having their homes and synagogues bombed as a result, community centers bombed, a couple having to flee north among death threats. One rabbi stated in a sermon that if God could be perceived of as having a color, God is certainly Black. because 2/3 of God's children are black. And if you're sitting, I believe he was in Dallas, but I'm not sure that that's the one it was. If you're sitting there in the South saying that in the 1950s, you're sort of asking for trouble. So there was a notion that Jews were afraid and silent. And in fact, some were, and they received a lot of threats when they spoke up. We have a really proud history at that point in time of joining together with African Americans and fighting for civil rights together. One last thing is, in this area, we had Rabbi Arthur Lelyveld, who was part of the Freedom Rides. That was, if anyone's young enough to have not learned about the Freedom Rides, when Northerners came down south to try to get African Americans registered to vote. And he was one of a few who were beaten in the South for doing that. And Rabbi Alan Green, who was one of my rabbis, also marching as often as possible. So the history changes pretty dramatically at that point. If we jump to today, and we'll talk more in a moment, we have both some successes and some challenges and chances to rebuild.
Well, that's exactly where I wanted to shift the conversation to, is where are we at today? You know, when we think about that legacy that started, you know, centuries ago, but then also the civil rights era, where you see, as you mentioned, the Freedom Rides going down south together. When you think about the March on Washington, you think about, you know, that allyship that was moving the country forward. Where do you see things at today?
I'm going to make you answer that too, but so today I think we still are communities that naturally should be bound together in very many ways. When we look at the Freedom Riders, 2/3 of them were Jews, and Jews make up about 2% of the country's population, so it was remarkable at that time. We'd love to rebuild that type of support. I think what's changed is the African American community is, at least in some ways, empowered in ways that it wasn't, and able and ready to drive its own change, as it should be. So the Jewish community needs a chance to figure out what's our role as allies, as support staff, right? We don't need to be in the limelight. What do we do now that is supportive? And how can the Black community support us where we have struggles and not the same struggles? So today, it's really much more tenuous and complex.
And that's one of the questions we want you, I know y'all got paper in front of you and whatnot, that's a question we're gonna pose to you all, is what are those areas where we could have camaraderie around as communities and work together on? What are those issues where we can be sticking up for one another, standing up for one another, locking arms together? So I want your mind to start percolating around what is the issue of today that we could be really working together on. So we have a couple examples of folks trying to figure that out. As I mentioned before, we both were in the Rekindle program. I'd love to hear your experience. I'll definitely share mine around what Rekindle meant for you as a rabbi, and I'll definitely share what it meant for me as a mayor. And I guess I'll go first. So our group met on Sunday evenings. There were 6 Sundays where we met for about 4 hours each session. And we unpacked the history, but then we also had very interesting dialogues around stereotypes. And so there's very unique stereotypes around both communities. And it was some tense times in the room, but it was the type of difficult conversations we need to have as a country, because we put them on the table, we were really able to address them. And what I learned was some of them were really rooted out of what we call generational trauma. So one of the stereotypes around Jewish people was around business ownership and around this idea of entrepreneurship, like it was a good stereotype. But what we learned was that a part of that generational trauma that was passed down, because you weren't being hired and you were being excluded from the economy, it drove people to become entrepreneurs, and that's what drove. And so you want to speak a little bit about, you know, some of the facts and myths around. It was interesting because you know, there was positive and negative stereotypes of both groups, and it was so easy to embrace the positive ones, but when we got into the negative ones, everyone wanted to kind of defend themselves. But yeah, you want to share about what you learned about from the African American community from your experience in Rekindle?
Sure, and we were in different sessions. Mine was the midweek session, same idea, different crew. I want to speak first about what you just said about stereotypes, because I think that's the most important thing we can address as communities together. It's really hard when I speak to interfaith groups to get them to do it, but my favorite questions are the ones that would be, in quotes, offensive. Because if you don't ask those questions, you don't get those answers. So Rekindle affords that opportunity. The other thing I want to say about stereotypes is the positive ones are the dangerous ones sometimes. So positive stereotypes of Jews are really educated and have money. Statistically, we do okay, we're not nearly where those stereotypes put us. Jumps to Jews own everything and control the world. So it's something that may look like a positive and actually is the cause for a whole lot of the misery we face. What was important to me in Rekindle was that...
Before you go on, I think that was one of the big takeaways, I think, for our group, was that when we talk about anti-Semitism and, you think about Kyrie Irving's comments, and you think about other comments that people have made, and there's this this reaction that sometimes doesn't seem proportional to the comment. So somebody says something small, like, that's just, the Jews run that. And then all of a sudden you get this huge push where you're like, wow, what was that? And you helped, and others in our group helped us see the line that was drawn between those sort of comments and what they lead to. So can you unpack that a little bit about the correlation between when that is heard sometimes in the past, that sort of rhetoric has been used to do what?
So Mayor Whitfield and I met after our fellowship and talked about these issues as the Kyrie and Kanye things were unfolding. And it was one of the most enlightening conversations I've ever had, because we believe essentially the same thing. We heard such different things, right? And pulled such different things. So for many Jewish people, when they hear, the Jews just own that, or the Jews just do that, you name it, what we think about, right? So that's the cause of disenfranchisement in Europe. That's the stereotypes that lead to the Holocaust. That's all kinds of things for us.
Sort of scapegoating, like the Jews have been scapegoated in the past when things weren't going right. We see it in America at times. When the economy's not going well, we find someone to blame. Oh, it's the folks that are crossing the border. They're the reason. And so Jews, when things when people weren't happy, Jews were being used as a scapegoat to say, oh, they're in control of all this stuff. They're the reason why,
Exactly. Where, as we spoke, there are other issues of identity and empowerment that may be meant in a positive way being spoken, that might not be working. So it's really important to unpack all of that. But in terms of what was important to me, I don't know the numbers now. African Americans are at least, I think, over 15% of the country's population. 13? You're stuck at 13% of the population. We're this little 2%. But we make a lot of noise sometimes, right? So for African Americans to choose to come and learn about Jews, who aren't in the news as an oppressed minority all the time, right? Who are a religious group, was remarkable to me. For Jews to come and learn with African Americans, less remarkable. We have that history. So that was the biggest thing for me. I wish we spent more time on the African American community's issues, but the importance of asking questions and beginning to build relationships was what mattered most to me.
It was interesting, in our group, that conversation happened. There was a group of us in our group that were sharing, why are African Americans always showing up for other groups? And it was kind of like, we got enough issues to deal with on our own, but still somehow we keep finding ways to show up for other groups. And it was kind of a two-edged sword. It was like, this is a part of our pride that we show up for other groups and are always standing up for the oppressed. But it was also like a bit of frustration of like, we have enough issues in our community. And one of the things we talked about was violence in particular, that we felt like in our community when violence happens, and kind of go to one of the negative stereotypes, was this idea around community violence. In our community, when violence happens, that we didn't see allies coming into our community. That, it was great when Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd protest, everybody was, locking arms with us, but the day-to-day violence that we deal with and trying to address, that we didn't feel like there was allies that were showing up for us. And I don't know if that came out in your group, but that was definitely a place where we felt like, we need some more additional support.
I'm really glad you mentioned that. That was actually one of the most interesting things that came up in our group, because the response was from somebody who weren't invited. We don't feel invited. And then the answer to that was, you don't need to be invited. And the really powerful image, I don't remember where it happened, was you get invited invited to a wedding, you don't get invited to a funeral, right? You show up at a funeral. And when a community is in crisis, you don't have to be invited, you just show up.
That was my quote, by the way.
Was it you? Okay.
My poetry here.
That's awesome. It's an awesome. See, I remember stuff, just not where it came from. But the other piece of that is when I mentioned that we as Jews need to find out how to figure out how to be supportive and how to be allies. I think many of us are very conscious of not wanting to push to the front something that's important to us and important for all of us and related to all of us, and yet not our. So it's important for us as Jews, as anyone who is not a person of color, to realize that you need to get over that enough to at least show up. And that not showing up isn't being polite, it's being hurtful.
For sure.
And that went both ways, by the way, right? When we talked about some of the tragedies in the Jewish community in the last few years, people showed up in force after the shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue in Whitfield in Pittsburgh 3 years ago? A few years ago. And we don't always feel that same sense of showing up, nor do we necessarily expect it because we're not in mortal danger the same way as some of the violence in the Black community has put us. But that sense of how good it feels when people don't wait to be invited is what it feels.
You know, one of the other things we talked about was what are those sort of barriers that keep our communities from working together. And I know, and you mentioned the east side of Cleveland. Cleveland has a much larger Jewish community, a much more organized Jewish community. But let's talk a little bit about what are those barriers. We talked about housing and other barriers, but what are some of the things that kind of hold us back from working together like we could? I think, again, in the city of Elyria, I think it's a lack of conversations like this. I think because the Jewish community is such a small community that we need to have forums like this to let folks know, hey, there's this other group of folks here in our city who worship in our city, who gather, who serve in our city, so that out of this, relationships are built so that we can work together. So I think just a lack of awareness of this happening within our city and folks being here, I would say in the city.
Absolutely. And you mentioned housing, Cleveland being, and I know we're Elyria, Lorain here, but I'm not sure it's a whole lot better in terms of housing segregation being among the worst in the country. But I think there's also, I think politeness is overrated. This goes back to the same thing about stereotypes. We're afraid to ask. We're afraid to show up. We don't want to impose. And then on the other side of that, we don't know how to be hospitable. So if for instance, our synagogue wants to let everybody know they're welcome, how do we do that? Who do we go to? If a Black church wants to let the white community know, who do they go to and how do they make it known? So I think we need to be more creative about how we reach out and bolder about who we want to speak to make these things happen. And then I would also add, there's just one other barrier. I guess it's media and sort of common knowledge now are not working to bring these two communities together. There's a lot of focus on some truthful and some not at all accurate rhetoric about the two communities that pulls us apart, and we need to fight that as well.
And I think that was one of the things we talked a lot about was Kyrie Irving. So Kyrie Irving, so you had the Kanye, you had Kyrie Irving. So Kanye, we said, all right, that's crazy. He's out there. All his comments should be dismissed, condemned. Nothing to learn from there other than not only get that brother some help, but close out his comments so that his rhetoric doesn't get out here. But the Kyrie example, we talked about, Kyrie, to me, came across as a young man searching for identity. And that we talked about how in the African American tradition, we've been stripped intentionally in this country from our identity. And I don't think we grasp that enough in the country, that literally slaves were, my great-great-grandmother was not allowed to read. She was not allowed to continue her language. She was not allowed to continue her cultural tradition. She was stripped of the tribe that she came from. to be. And then you get a group that comes out of that, clawing and scraping their way out of that, and now looking for identity. And then you have someone, Kyrie, who's clearly just searching. Where am I from? Where did I connect with? And he comes across this Hebrew Israelite, a commentary that says, hey, you are one of the original people. God is into your story. Take pride in who you are. And he started to find resonance in that, but it also, he was triggering because where he was getting the source from was an anti-Semitic group who had done not only just like vocal damage, but had done physical. This group was also responsible for doing physical harm to Jewish people. So we talked about how, you know, someone with goodwill can get hijacked in this media circuit and end up being, you know, portrayed in a very negative light when in all actuality it was just a young man searching for identity. And I think one of my big things that I'm hoping is that we provide a place for curiosity without cancellation. And conversations like we're doing today, conversations like I hope that are happening within these equity groups. And again, thank you LCC for the invite. Thank you Dr. Douglas, Kionna. Thank y'all for having that equity group in there, because that's the place where you can have those curious and courageous conversations with the hopes that folks don't walk away canceled. And because I think if we continue with that cancellation of folks are gonna be afraid to be curious, they're gonna be afraid to answer or ask questions or answer questions, and then they're gonna stay stuck at where they are. So that leads us to the next piece of what are those things that we could be working on as a community. I have a quote from Dr. King on that I want to share. Dr. King said, it really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. That was from one of his speeches in 1967. So again, what do we need each other for right now in this moment? And locally, nationally, globally, what do you see we need each other for right now?
I think in the simplest terms, a group that is being attacked shouldn't have to be the group that defends itself. Now, we will, right? And we want to. The Jewish community doesn't want to be silent when we're attacked. I don't think the Black community wants to be silent. But those who are attacking don't listen to the group they're attacked. And it's important that someone else speak up each time. So if an African American is unjustly harmed or killed by police, it shouldn't be just the Black communities. If Kanye is saying DEFCON whatever to the Jews, it shouldn't just be the Jewish community speaking up. Because then we sound like we're whining, right? So the most basic thing we can do is, and this goes, by the way, beyond Black and Jewish. This is any group you see who is not you. Any place where you are the one who has the power or the comfort or the safety. You're the one who should be speaking. So there are places where, as a woman, I am marginalized and I don't have power to say what is wrong. Someone who is not a woman should be speaking up. There are places where my gender has no role and I am very empowered by being a white woman, you know, middle-class woman, and I should be speaking up. So it's looking at what communities we have the power to speak in support of. I don't want to say to speak for, but to speak in support of when these things happen. And just the fact that many Jews, not all, many Jews may look white, doesn't mean we're so empowered that we don't need someone else to speak up, that there aren't times when a member of the Black community or the Latino community couldn't have a powerful voice for us. So that's the first thing. So the other thing is to think about what issues, I mean, if we want to go beyond getting to know each other.
Okay, before we get into the issues yet, because I see where you're about to go. The empowerment piece. We talked about, and prep for this, around where are those areas of empowerment that our communities have that we can share in that empowerment. That's a question for you all to think about as well. She mentioned this power dynamic of in a room, and I've seen it many times here at LCC, LCCC. And they've done an amazing job changing the culture here and changing the dynamics here. But when I first came here, you'd go in a room and it was predominantly white men, and there'd be a few black men, and then there'd be a few women, very few women. And you mentioned this power dynamic of that woman needing to advocate for herself versus other men stepping up and being allies and saying, hey, that was inappropriate, don't say that anymore, and really being that ally. So they're using their power of numbers to utilize their privilege to be an ally and help move something forward. But as communities that we're talking about in terms of Jewish community, African American community, what are those areas that you feel like the Jewish community is empowered and could be sharing in that power and empowerment with the African American community to help progress in these issues?
That's a really hard question. I think that's why we threw it at you for after this. So because the issue with being an ally is you can't do the thing you want to do. You have to do the thing that others need you to do. And that involves more listening than talking. Very, very quick tangent, because I know we don't have long. I did a program in Ghana with American Jewish World Service, and the head told a story about
He's going to take me to Ghana. I've been talking about taking me to Ghana for about 10 years now.
It was a dream forever. So the head of the program was telling us about a group trying to help in a school, and the school wasn't really a school, it was like a little shack. And they wanted to bring in, like, what could we do if we do use computers, or do you need books, or do you need, and they were trying to think of what to do, and it's a one-teacher school, and the teacher said, we want breakfast. You know, and breakfast didn't occur to those who were trying to come in and take control. So you have to listen and find out, is it breakfast or is it books, right? What matters more? So I can't speak as well for where we're empowered as much as for where can we use help. But I think I can a little bit. The Jewish community is empowered in that we did a really good job early on of connecting to one another. And it came out of both necessity and being lucky in that we have certain cultural and linguistic connections that allowed us to do that, to create organizations successfully. So we have the ability to rally people for causes, for example, right? Or to get messages out in a way that can be helpful to other communities. It's a matter of making the choice to do so. So that's one area where I think we have something to offer. In terms of what we can use is exactly what I said before. People from other communities standing up to their own community or making simple statements that are supportive of the Jewish community. And it might be as simple as, I hope it's a meaningful Passover for my Jewish friends on a social media post, because that signals that you respect the Jewish community. Even if you don't have Jewish friends, right? We're all friends, we're all neighbors. Something like that is a place where I think minority communities have a much larger voice than they may give themselves credit for.
And I would echo that one of the places of empowerment that we talked about is political power in particular. When we talked about, like, right now, there's the most African Americans elected to Congress and the Senate than there's ever been in the history of the country. And like, that's an opportunity for us to use that political strength to combat hate and also support our Jewish brothers and sisters. Areas of support that I know that we need. One is that allyship, or just using your voice and platform. But the institutional infrastructure that many folks have outside of our community, whether it's white folks, Jewish folks, etc., access to resources. You think about a group of people who have been redlined, discriminated against for loans. I think about the interestfree.org. I think about the Hebrew Free Loan Association that provides interest-free loans to folks to help them get through. That to me is a whole different way of supporting and being an ally to our community. I just heard a beat go off. Does that mean we're getting close to time?